Welcome back to Explorer. We want to thank you for joining. As you all know, at this moment, the continent of Africa is going to a huge geopolitical shift, and more importantly, the continent of Africa is speaking louder than before. That's caused a lot of geopolitical concern with regards to its strategic partner from Europe, the United States of America, China, Russia, across the Middle East. And this is the reason why the African leaders are demanding that now or never is the moment that the continent of Africa should be represented in the seat of the United Nations. I'm talking about a permanent seat at the UN. You can imagine that this is not going to be an easy issue. This has been on the table for the past 8 years, and the leaders of the continent have been pushing, despite some credits given to them. The UN system is so complicated that at the moment, the continent of Africa has pushed so far to an extent where the glass ceiling will be broken in a moment. The question here is, a number of people are so doubtful that Africa will never push this, but no one would have believed a couple of years or 100 years ago that there will be a first black president in the United States, and that appetite will be stopped in South Africa, and an African leader will manage that particular country, and the continent of Africa will see huge changes. That Africa would have the African Continental Free Trade Area will come into play. All of these were pipe dreams before, but at the moment, the continent is speaking with one voice, and that's the reason why the former African Union ambassador to the United States of America, Dr. ARIKANA Chihombori, recently appeared on the Qatar-based television station Aljazeera, and she clearly laid it out that there is no negotiation with regards to this particular issue regarding Africa having a seat onto the United Nations Security Council with voting rights. The point here is that she indicated that as a result of not allowing Africa to sit on that table, it's a total disgrace, and also it's going to be like an insult to 1.4 billion people. Let's roll the clip and we will join you on the other side.
And now Washington is talking about creating permanent seats for 2 African nations, but get this, with no veto power. Why? And why now? Today we're talking with ARIKANA Chihombori, former ambassador of the African Union to the United States. Ambassador, it's terrific to have you back on our show. I want to start with a film clip of the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield. Let's listen.
As it stands, there are currently 3 non-permanent seats on the Security Council allocated to African countries on a rotating basis for 2 years. The problem is these elected seats don't enable African countries to deliver the full benefit of their knowledge and voices to the work of the Council, to consistently lead on the challenges that affect all of us and disproportionately affect Africa. That is why, in addition to non-permanent memberships for African countries, the United States supports creating 2 permanent seats for Africa on the Council. It's what our African partners seek, and we believe this is what is just.
Ambassador Chihombori, let me ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how enthusiastic are you about the proposal that the ambassador has just made?
I think it's a step in the right direction. However, keeping in mind that this issue has been on the table, ongoing for, like you said, 80 years. If we are going to right the wrong, why can't we just right this wrong once and for all? If Africa is going to become a member of the UN Security Council, a permanent member, they must have the full rights just like the other 5 members, which means they must have veto power. Inviting Africa to the table and then asking them to remain mute, it's an insult not only to the African leaders, but it is an insult to 1.4 billion people. We appreciate what Ambassador Greenfield is saying. We appreciate the efforts she has made. But if she is going to complete this journey that has been going on for far too long, a journey that clearly exemplifies the continued disrespect of the African continent, Ambassador Greenfield must push for us to take this issue to the finish line. Africa must have 2 permanent seats at the UN Security Council with full veto power. Nothing less is acceptable. And I do believe that the United Nations, understanding how long this issue has been going on, how long the disrespect of the African continent has been going on, it is shameful that the United Nations would want to continue to blatantly disrespect the Africans by inviting them to the table, but then saying, sorry, you can't eat. You can only watch us play our games. You can watch us enjoy the 10-course meal. What a joke. What an insult. And I do hope that the African leaders are not going to accept it. Africa must be at the table as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and the 2 seats must have veto power, plain and simple, period.
We are going to come back to that interview in just a moment. But first, let's look at the recent United States of America African Countries Summit which took place in the US. The US President Joe Biden and Kamala Harris talk about supporting Africa to have permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. But the question here is, what has happened? But first, let's listen to what Joe Biden said, and then we will come back to look into what the ambassador talked about it.
Africa belongs to the table in every room where global challenges are being discussed, and in every institution where discussions are taking place. That's why I announced in September at the United Nations General Assembly that the United States fully supports reforming the UN Security Council to include permanent representation for Africa. And today I'm also calling for the African Union to join the G20 as a permanent member of the G20. Finally, I'm grateful that all of you made the journey to Washington for this summit.
The big question here that a lot of Africa's geopolitical partners are failing to understand, in this case the United States of America. Africa cannot be away, like Joe Biden himself said, out of the table where important decisions are being taken regarding the continent's own future. Africa needs to be there. With regards to the current discussion, the former ambassador, Dr. ARIKANA Chihombori, dive into more perspective with regards to question that came from the Aljazeera reporter. Let's take a listen and we will close this episode.
Do you think Ambassador Thomas Greenfield doesn't understand this? What do you think is behind this offer? When you said, hey, you appreciate the progress she's made. We do know that this was a promise or a commitment that President Joe Biden is trying to fulfill before the end of his term. But do you think they are not aware about how controversial it is to create permanent seats without votes?
Of course they know what they're doing. So, again, that's where the disrespect comes in. They know what they're doing. They know what the right thing to do is. No, we do not want to dilute our veto power if we give 2 more seats with veto power. No, we are simply saying the slice is big enough. The world is bigger than 5 countries representing over 7 billion people. We are simply saying serious wrongs have been perpetrated against Black people. Here is an opportunity for President Biden to right this wrong. This is an opportunity that we cannot miss. Africans must be at the table. 1.4 billion people must be represented. The continued disrespect of the Africans has got to come to an end. So we're asking President Biden and his running mate, Kamala Harris, who I hope will be the next president of the United States, they will right this wrong once and for all. And Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, we understand all the work that you have done. Please, as a sister, as an ambassador, we're asking you to take this issue to the finish line. Permanent positions on the UN Security Council with full veto power like the other 5 Ps.
We will close down this episode in a moment, but first, the question about China and Russia came up on how Africa perceived this particular conversation with regards to these 2 very important geopolitical partners. With regards to this, China and Russia are okay to look into the perspective of the continent of Africa with regards to permanent seat. But the question was again thrown to the ambassador. This is how she approached this question with regards to this very important issue. That's the reason why African countries are standing strong, that either now or never with regards to this very important strategic period in the continent of Africa. Let's listen to that and then let's close this episode for today.
I've seen that China and Russia are enthusiastic and do support Africa's position on the Security Council with 2 permanent seats, but I have not seen whether they would actually agree to giving the veto to African countries as well. Your thoughts?
Well, normally, like most issues pertaining to Africa, what I've found is that the United Nations usually, sorry, not the United Nations, the United States usually has the final say. If the United States is going to come in and say, we support fully Africa being on the UN Security Council with full veto power, I can assure you the other 4 members will follow suit. The United States, if the United States decides they do not wish for Africa to have veto power, it will not happen. But if the United States decides they do want Africa to have veto power, the other countries, I'm pretty sure, will follow suit.
One of the things that Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the ambassador of the United States to the UN, said about her resistance to giving more countries a veto on this is that it would make the council more dysfunctional. And it made me wonder whether any nation should have a veto power. Is there a model in the future of the United Nations where we suspend veto power for all countries and we go to majority votes on key decisions?
First of all, I find that comment very, very insulting. You are simply suggesting that the addition of 2 African countries is going to make the process dysfunctional. What an insult. If this particular situation, we're talking a country like Germany, if we're talking any of the other European countries joining as members of the UN Security Council with veto power, would she still find it as a move that will introduce dysfunction? Or is it the introduction of 2 Black African countries that is problematic? What really makes it very sad is that the voices are coming out of the mouth of a Black woman. Those words are coming out of the mouth of an African American who must understand certain language cannot be used, particularly when we're talking about the international platform. To suggest that introducing 2 African countries will introduce dysfunction, it is sad, it is disrespectful, and it will not be tolerated. Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield really needs to retract those words, and she needs to explain herself to say, what do you mean dysfunction? Exactly how are the 2 African countries going to introduce dysfunction, unless, of course, the entity has already been dysfunctional, which in my opinion is the case, and that is what really is the problem with the United Nations. It's a dysfunctional entity. It is a toothless bulldog, and they need to do what they are mandated to do by the world. So yes, no, Africa is not going to introduce any dysfunction at the United Nations. The entity itself has been dysfunctional. Maybe an addition of 2 African countries might straighten it up and create some normalcy, and for a change have an entity that's going to truly represent people of the world. As it is right now, it is a relationship, it is an entity that was designed to steal from the developing nations. It is an entity whose entire purpose and plan and reason for being created was to steal from developing nations. So let's be clear. If we are going to speak truth to power, the UN Security Council has been dysfunctional, remains dysfunctional, until it is an entity that truly represents the whole world. At this point, the UN Security Council does not represent the world. So yes, they should be ashamed. It is a dysfunctional entity that maybe the inclusion of other nations might actually make it less dysfunctional.
Yes, you've heard it there, absolutely clear. It's a contentious issue and Africa is on top of this. That's the reason why the ambassador is pretty clear with regards to her position and where Africans stand. Using the words of the United States of America ambassador to the United Nations, talking about dysfunctionality, that's a huge concern, and that is not sitting well with Africa's geopolitical partners, and also more importantly in the continent of Africa. It's a cause for concern. This cannot be that a number of political issues that are representative of the continent and issues that affect the region are happening in the United Nations, and Africa does not have a representation. This is a big problem. However, a number of experts say that Africa will push, and definitely it will have a representation in one of these years. We all are looking to see what's going to happen and why Africa should sit there, to the words of the ambassador, to bring some sanity with regards to the particular issues happening in the United Nations Security Council. We want to thank you for watching. If you are new here, we encourage you to watch some of our informative video on this YouTube channel. We are looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Smash the like button, share the video with your different network, and also enrich your geopolitical knowledge within the continent of Africa and how Africa deals with its geopolitical partners. For now, we are looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye-bye.